Great. Well, thank you, Naeem, and welcome everyone. My name is Mary Viktorovich. I'm the interim director of the Dahdaleh Institute at York, and we welcome our annual graduate and welcome to our annual Graduate Student Symposium. Today, we're excited to showcase the current work of PhD and master's students associated with the Institute who will present their current research journeys in their respective graduate studies. As is our usual custom, I would like to begin by acknowledging that York is situated on the traditional territorial area known as Takaranto, and we acknowledge its current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. We acknowledge this as the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations, including the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and the Métis. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. So throughout the years, we've been fortunate to have some wonderful students that have been part of the Institute. Today, we get to really showcase some of their work and celebrate their journey and progress in their respective research. The presenters today have been pivotal to the work at the Institute with numerous contributions and collaborations that advance our research agenda. It's a great chance for us to learn more about the individual work of the graduate students. In line with our collaborative approach, today's program will entail a Q&A session and discussion, which can be very beneficial to the students and further help in developing a more refined research project. We hope their work can also inspire some prospective partners and collaborations. So let me begin with the introduction to our first speaker. So Nell Ganguli, correct me Nell if I'm mispronouncing, is a Master of Environmental Studies student at the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change at York. She has a bachelor's degree in biotechnology, also from York, and 6 years of work experience in West Africa in gold mining. In her master's research, Nell is applying systems thinking to study the gender and health impacts of climate change in Lake Chilwa, Malawi. So over to you, Nell, and I will present the other two just before they present.
Can you see my slide?
Yes.
Yep, just make it full screen and you'll be okay.
Yeah, okay. So hi everyone, super excited to be here, especially because I defended this yesterday. It's very fresh. So even though the title of my research is specific to Lake Chilwa, I wanted to spend some time discussing the work that I did to understand gendered health impacts of climate change in Global South, in rural Global South. So half of my presentation will be on that, and then the other half will be to Lake Chilwa. So these were my three guiding questions. And before I begin, I should say that my research is pretty much based on a project that's going on at Dahdaleh that James is leading in Lake Chilwa. So they were looking at 4 subsystems, and I decided to look at the same subsystems, but add a gender lens to it. So I broke my research into 3 components. Component 1 was a more general climate change and health. Variables for climate change and health. The second was more gender specific, and then third was applied to Lake Chilwa. So because this is pretty much a desktop research, I use systematic literature review to generate my database. And for the analysis, I did a bibliometric analysis to understand the state of the research, the gender health impacts of climate change, that topic, and then identified variables, interlinkages, exposure pathways, and specific health impacts. And then I applied that to the Chilwa Basin, but also part of my objective was to develop complex systems diagrams, which are rich pictures and influence diagrams. So these can be used for future validation stages from the community, at the community level. So just some results from my bibliometric analysis. I thought that was pretty important, considering that research in this topic has been increasing since 2015. So for component 1, which was more general, only about 38 countries from Global South The articles were from about 38 countries, the majority in Africa and Asia. And the component 2, I found articles from 25 countries, majority in Africa, and about 4 Asian countries, Bangladesh, India, Nepal, and Pakistan. I also looked at authors' locations. So only for component 2, to the distribution, as you can see, 44% of the articles were from global north, 27% from global south, and collaboration was only in 29% of the articles. I went ahead and I also looked at I was just curious to find out how all female and all male authorship how the comparison would be from global south and north. And as you can see, all males from global south and all males from global north is pretty comparable, but all females from global north is obviously starkly higher than all females from global south. So I think that was a pretty good takeaway and something definitely that we can work towards improving. I also did a number of articles per subsystem in component 1 and 2. So you can see that most of the articles from component 1 were from communicable diseases and non-communicable diseases, and in component 2, most of them were from food security. I identified about 112 variables in component 1. I won't go through the examples. And from component 2, 53 were gender specific. So now I'll move into the application to Chilwa Basin. So I think all of us here know where Chilwa is, but I'll just quickly say it again. Lake Chilwa is located in the southeastern part of Malawi and one of the most vulnerable areas to climate change, but they also suffer from acute poverty and population increase, which is sort of and the climate change is basically exacerbating these existing health impacts and existing social and economic inequities in the area. So when I looked at I used a systems approach again. I did a systematic literature review to identify the health impacts that are already been identified and sort of filled in the gap using my knowledge from component 1 and 2. So in general, in total, I identified about 60 variables. 49 of them were gender specific. And then part of my objective was to develop systems diagrams. So on the left, you can see that's a rich picture, basically a snapshot of what I understood after, from the information that I gathered from, peer-reviewed articles and gray literature. So for example, you can see that with increasing temperature and lake water, levels of lake water lowering lake waters, the taifa bush around the lake would be dying, which actually acts as nutrient pump. But instead, nutrients would be leaching into the lake, increasing eutrophication, which would also increase cholera prevalence in the area. On the right, that's just from the rich picture. On the right is an inference diagram, and you can see that where basically we want to details and show the relationship between the variables. The red arrows show negative relationships, the black shows positive relationships, and the blue arrows sort of show that the relationships that are not yet quantified. For example, marital status has an impact on female workload, but so you can only talk about it whether they're married or unmarried, and it's very hard to quantify that. Or let's say I don't know how to quantify that yet. So just key takeaways. I have no idea how much time I have. Am I still okay? The time?
You have about 5 minutes actually. So
really? I went really fast. So maybe I'll just spend some time on my key takeaways. So I found gendered health impacts of climate change, this topic, to be extremely complex and very contextual. So from my experience, generalization should be ignored as much as possible. Avoided, not ignored, as much as possible. Gender intersectionality is also very crucial, and this is something that comes up in every presentation that I've been in that talks about gender and climate change studies. I also found that social and economic factors play a more dominant role than environmental factors when it comes to gendered health impacts of climate change. And all these three I think systems approach is highly recommended in this type of research because it sort of encapsulates all these 3 or 4 points that I talked about, whether it is the fact that gender is not just, a biological phenomena, but also a social construct. The gender intersectionality is also crucial. By that, I mean that all men and all women do not face the same health impacts. And things like variables like race, marital status, number of dependents also affect the level of vulnerability that these women or men face. And emerging properties of systems can encapsulate that, that issue in gender, which is slowly becoming very popular. And the complexity, systems is known to tackle complexity with from a very systematic approach. So this is why I thought my approach to this research was adequate. Also, I found that empirical research in this area is extremely limited, and data is missing, which is also something that you hear in many presentations that discuss gendered health impacts of climate change. And lastly, I thought there was a great statement that I came across by Joseph Ngoli, who's the country lead of Royal Fish Malawi. Simply targeting women is not empowerment. Women's empowerment requires the inclusion of men as agents of change. And in some of the articles, I already sort of got a glimpse of this. With climate change, men in some communities where gender roles are embedded into their social structures, men are being forced to help women if they do things like digging wells or carrying water. So with climate change, this question came to my mind: is this a practice that will become more widespread, where men are supporting women in doing jobs that are specifically women? Women's duties or women's responsibilities. But on the other side, I found that men are being affected from crop losses and income losses more deeply than women. So with climate change, if this is something that only gets worse, one, domestic violence might get worse, so women might suffer more than they're suffering now. Or what about the insecurity that men will face? Like this, I read in an article where they talked about men feeling insecure because they're losing their income, and that is impacting their social status. So will they come home? And because that is in the household, they're a king. Will this only further force them to take it basically the same thing, like domestic violence might just get worse. I'm getting jumbled here, but I think I'll stop there, and I'm happy to share my report, which is pretty long and boring. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Nell. That was great. So let's reserve our questions for the end after all 3 presenters have had a chance, but thank you very much. So now moving on to our next presenter, who is Dixon Lai. So Dixon has been taught in law schools from the University of Exeter, the UK, and the Chinese University of Hong Kong, holding both an LLB, Bachelor of Laws, and a Master of Laws, LLM. Dixon is currently pursuing a research LLM at Osgoode Hall, aiming to expand his skills as a scholar to progress into the PhD program. As a Chinese-born Canadian, Dixon has spent many years living in Hong Kong and the UK. His research interests have been geared toward environmental law, energy law, international law, environmental justice, human rights law, law and development, and most extensively, disaster law. His topic of presentation today will recount the taking of responsibility for disasters throughout history, in which he examines the relationship between states, people, and disasters and how corresponding laws have come about. So Dixon, over to you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dixon, and thank you, Mary, for the introduction. I've had a change in sort of the title of my topic. So this is sort of the change in the title. I will be speaking on very similar things, though. So the topic is reimagining international legal history through third world disasters. So first of all, what is a disaster? Well, the definition I've come to use within my research is that a disaster is an event that causes substantial disruption to society or overwhelms the response capability of society through damage and destruction of environment, property, human lives, and well-being. So here we have some classic examples: earthquakes, hurricanes, forest fires. But the one thing I would like to point out is sometimes the actual event is not the disaster itself, but rather the consequence of the event. And the consequence of the event is usually through the social conditions that the victims themselves are in. So sort of loss of homes, loss of life, because of inadequate protection against those hazards is usually the case. And one other thing I'd like to sort of raise now is that it's not really obvious when something is a disaster. Homelessness, sort of poverty, these things can be considered disasters in some sense, but it's not particularly caused by a quick hitting a singular event. So a really good example that I have of what a disaster can be considered is something that happened in Chile, in this city called Iquique, which is located on the desert on the border to the Pacific Ocean. Now, the average rainfall in that city is about 0.5 milliliters to 1 milliliters a year. And what happened was that in a situation where 0.2 milliliters of rain came down on a day, caused electrical breakdowns and damage to over 4,000 houses, mainly low-income houses within that city. To put that in contrast, Toronto's average rainfall is about 831 milliliters a year, so that's 2.3 milliliters a day on average. So it would be fair to say that 0.2 milliliters of rain wouldn't have stopped you from going to the beach that day. So what we can get from this is that disasters are usually not the hazard itself, but that the social vulnerability of those suffering from the consequences of that hazard is what considers something to be a disaster. Now, moving on to my research, I've just finished my proposal. I have only started in the fall term, and I will emphasize the following. So firstly, international law favors in very many ways the first world over the third world. The first world I mean by sort of modernized, rich Western countries like Canada, for example, and the third world is sort of the underdeveloped countries in the world. So second point is that international law both creates and mitigates disasters in third world nations. And that's important because the creation of disasters in the third world is often ignored in place of the mitigation of disasters. So I'll be addressing the following literature gap within the legal literature. Firstly, there is a lack of representation of the third world in regards to disaster governance within international law. And secondly, there's a lack of a multidisciplinary approach in that regard. So I've stumbled upon the following research question. So how has the development of international law within the last 5 decades regarding causes of disasters structurally disadvantaged the third world? Now, I chose the last 50 years because of sort of a changing within international law's history, where it was sort of the beginning of the end of the Cold War and the shift towards globalization, expansion of Western liberal democracy, and sort of the entrenchment and empowerment of many international institutions as we know today. And international law both creates and mitigates disaster risk. So what types of international law am I talking about? So we can look at human rights, so development laws, trade laws, environmental protection laws, just to put a few examples. And now we can begin to see how some of these things create disaster risk and some of them mitigate the risk. So we can see through trade, investment, sovereignty, the international law regime around these areas often creates many risks of disaster, especially on the third world. And in terms of mitigation, we can put human rights, climate change, global health, you name it. But often we find that the borders between those areas, between what creates risk and what mitigates risk, is not so clear, and some of them interlap and do both. So why am I researching this? Well, I've already stated that the third world is often negatively, sometimes positively impacted through those unequal power relations within international lawmaking between first world and third world. And that's not frequently realized within the international law scholarship. And it's only recently have third world states begin to start to fight back and really push for more accountability and responsibility for the first world. So we see that in sort of the climate change approach, where common but differentiated responsibilities was included. That is something that really represents that sort of change within the international law regime when it first came about in the 90s. So the international regime at the moment is nowhere where it needs to be for effective disaster governance policy for third world countries to enact themselves. And why am I doing the research this way? Well, explaining law in context is often extremely helpful to legal scholars and also others who want to understand how law and society interact. And multidisciplinary approaches are often criticized by historians, social scientists for not having the discipline in remaining objective. But that's not the objective of this piece. This project is meant to be critical and descriptive in a way that would challenge the reader's assumptions about global law and order. So I'll be using third world approaches to international law, a recognized school of legal law scholars, and also using quite a lot of non-legal critical writing from or about the third world. And the whole point of this is just to give a thorough understanding of society's behavior and norms, but based in a legal analysis. So that is basically the introduction to my research. You can find me on LinkedIn, or you can always reach me by email. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Dixon. So fascinating. So as I mentioned earlier, we'll save our questions for the very end. So our next speaker now is Isaac Weldon. So Isaac is a PhD candidate in the Department of Politics at York University and also a Dahdaleh Institute Research Fellow within the Global Strategy Lab. Before coming to York, Isaac completed a Master of Science in International Health Policy with distinction at the London School of Economics and Political Science. He also holds a Bachelor of Arts in History, Political Studies, and Economics from the University of Manitoba. Isaac's research focuses on using political and social science methods to reveal strategies for improving how the world responds to global health challenges. His doctoral research investigates how a planetary approach can unlock new ideas and practices for the global response to antimicrobial resistance, known as AMR as well. So Isaac, over to you.
Great, thanks, Mary, and hello, everyone. So I'm going to be talking about my PhD dissertation, which is currently in the works. In my fourth year of my PhD, so this is really the first full year wholly dedicated to research. And so this is still quite preliminary in terms of the findings that I discussed, but at least at this point, I have an overall understanding of the shape that the dissertation will take, as well as how each of the chapters will progress. And so that's essentially what I'll be presenting today. So as Mary mentioned, my dissertation is really a series of investigations kind of unified by this idea that a planetary perspective can unlock new ideas for AMR governance. And so essentially, I start by asking what are planetary challenges, and I try to make the case that AMR is one of these challenges. After doing that, I enter into a discussion on how that perspective can enable comparisons to other planetary challenges, specifically drawing on this concept of boundaries, drawing on the work from the Stockholm Resilience Institute on planetary boundaries. From there, I go on and investigate the AMR regime complex, which is the series of overlapping institutions that have emerged around this problem of AMR, thinking from a planetary perspective that the best way to look at the governance institutions is to be comprehensive, to zoom out and not just look at health, but to see how governance arrangements interact across the various sectors that AMR implicates. And then finally, a fourth chapter, the fourth part investigates specifically another planetary challenge, being biodiversity and biodiversity governance, looking for lessons that can be applied to AMR governance, specifically around how global biodiversity governance addresses or contends with the planetary nature of that problem. And then from there, I'll talk about some preliminary conclusions or where I see the research going. All right, so we know, I think with this audience, it's fairly, it's probably okay if I talk about planetary challenges as, that set of challenges that implicate the relationship between human activity, human societies, and the systems of Earth, the inorganic and organic systems of the Earth. So the way that water cycle unites us, the way that the climate unites us, these are all challenges that exist on this planetary register. They emerge from deeply ingrained and settled practices of human activity, and they're long enduring in that in some way, we will always have to find a way to contend with our relationship on this planet, with the systems of this planet. And I make the argument that we can see AMR as one of these challenges. So I invite the reader essentially to consider that microbes are all around us. They exist within us and they exist in the physical environment. In that way, we can conceive of them as potentially forming their own system of circulation, of existence, that it also exists on this level of planetary importance. Everything from the soil to our own bodies encompasses microbial systems. And because microbes are alive and all around us, we will always have to find a way to cohabitate with them. In that way, it's the same thing as we will always have to find a way to define our relationship with other organic life and the systems of the Earth. And also, antimicrobials are so ingrained in our societies that they've become essentially invisible infrastructure. They're so deeply ingrained, the same way that the use of fossil fuels might be, the way that the use of other natural resources might be. And so I try to make the argument that we can think of AMR as a planetary challenge. And what this enables us to do is draw upon concepts that are used to discuss other planetary challenges. And I suggest that this is helpful for many reasons. And already in the AMR literature, there are problems that are emerging with the way that we think about our relationship with microbes. Critiques about how AMR policy and AMR practices tend to project or reproduce some common fallacies that also exist in other areas. For example, this idea of human mastery over nature, or human removal from nature, or the idea of growth and progress as the ultimate objective of a society, and how microbes or antimicrobials are used to enable certain practices of growth and extraction and systems of labor. Also, there are critiques of narratives surrounding a war on microbes. So already there are critiques that exist about the way we think about our relationship with microbes can constrict the kinds of policies and actions towards them. So instead, one way that we can change the way we think about it is to draw on a concept used in other planetary issues, and that's this idea of safe operating spaces, or what I call microbial boundaries, drawing on this idea of planetary boundaries. And so if you see with the inner circle is red, and you can imagine that in that space, there's the under provision of essential medicines, public health interventions, and all the likes that enable microbial infections. Once we're able to achieve a certain level of public health interventions, be it access to antimicrobials, sanitation, hygiene, and the like, we enter into a safe operating space, kind of defined on one side by too little. But then if we use these medicines, particularly antimicrobials, too much, we then exit the safe operating space because the overuse of antimicrobials potentially selects for resistance. And we then enter into a situation where resistant microbes are then as potentially threatening as we were during under provision. And so I think this could be a way to not kind of make the same claims about humans being removed from nature. This is very much a way of thinking that situates societies and human activity within the systems of planetary realities. So from there, the project moves on to map the AMR regime complex, which is the arrangement of overlapping institutions that have emerged to govern AMR. So drawing on this idea of a planetary perspective and zooming out to look at the full arrangement of institutions, I draw on this concept of regime complexes, which is the idea that for any given issue, there's not just one regime of importance. There tends to be several, because regimes exist in a very complex international system. And so to start off with, we know that the WHO, the OIE, FAO, and UNEP are all greatly involved in AMR governance currently. So this is the starting point. Obviously, there are a lot more with various kinds of relationships with each other. And so this part of the project is simply to map them out from this planetary perspective. And then the last investigation considers how global biodiversity governance has dealt with essentially the misfit between governance principles, rules, norms, and procedures how essentially the system of human governance institutions that we've created, how do they contend with planetary characteristics of the problem that are seemingly at odds with these. So just take, for example, a norm of international governance or global governance is this idea of state sovereignty that's deeply ingrained in the way that we operate with global governance. But when you think of an issue like biodiversity and the distribution, the global distribution of natural resources around the world, it's seemingly at odds with this idea that every state is equal and equal in relation to each other. When you consider, just for example, Brazil having so much of the world's biodiverse rainforests. And so the norm then forms the rulemaking procedures, which in this case is multilateralism, assumes that equal participants will collectively form rules in the interest of the common good. But what that kind of ignores is the essentially very different starting points for these various countries, both in terms of how the planetary systems are distributed across states, but then also as a result of various histories, ongoing legacies of colonialism, and just essentially how the power is distributed in the international arena. So some preliminary conclusions, or where I see this research going, is that there's a key emphasis on learning about how ideas might precipitate a change in policy and practice. And I think this is something that we've seen, or we're starting to see in climate governance, at least, with phasing out fossil fuels and countries targeting net zero or net neutral economies, largely stemming from a change in ideas that then inform new policies and practices. For biodiversity governance, similar ideas about the importance of certain ecosystems and how that has changed the way that we think about governance. And again, I mentioned this briefly, but I think all of these challenges underscore the need for multilateralism, or at least some sort of collective decision-making rules, but there's also the need to do it better, whether it's through revising the various kinds of issues that are discussed through multilateralism, or the scope of what multilateralism can achieve. And that brings it to another point of how we might consider rules in international law or in international spheres, and how they relate not only to states, but also to other transnational actors or regional actors and cities and all the like. Another more pragmatically, what can these comparisons, or what can this line of scholarship provide? It might answer questions about the feasibility or desirability of having one single treaty or one single rulemaking body for an issue, given the complexity, given the overlapping features of the problems, and the ways that global governance operates currently, is whether or not it's worth the effort of unifying everything under one particular treaty or rulemaking body, or if there are other ways that that effective governance can be achieved. There are also opportunities for synergies between biodiversity and AMR policy. A key assumption, or a key point of thinking about planetary boundaries and planetary systems is their interrelationship with each other and among each other. So for example, biodiversity is in a way kind of a natural protection against potential blights or infections spreading, because diversity tends to be more resilient. So promoting diversity in agriculture might be a good way to cut down on the reliance on antimicrobial use. And then finally, there could be other techniques that are used to bring together actors for planning and action across other planetary challenges. So just one example that I've come across in biodiversity governance is this idea called multi-party single closing, which is from Wall Street, but it's used in biodiversity governance as a means for planning large-scale challenges across various kinds of stakeholders, whereby essentially everyone contributes a certain amount of money, but the money is only provided if there's a plan in place at a certain time. So if multi-parties contribute, but if the funding goal isn't met and if the plan isn't in place for how that money will be spent by a certain day, the whole thing collapses. So it's a way of instigating a project, of funding a project, which has widely successful outcomes in biodiversity, which could translate into potentially a technique for large-scale funding on big complex challenges like AMR. But that's all I have for today. I welcome any input, any questions, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Isaac, and Dixon and Nell. So wonderful overview of the directions that your research is going in. So I would now like to open it up for questions, but maybe I'll start with the first one. So Nell, you mentioned that you discussed your research in terms of the literature review and looking at authorship and so on. So is that part of your systems analysis, or will your systems analysis build on that?
I think that my bibliometric analysis was just to understand the status of the research. It was quite separate from my systems analysis, which I've already sort of completed from the qualitative sort of side. So yeah, the bibliometric analysis was just sort of out of curiosity. I wasn't even planning to do that, but I kind of understood where the work needs to be done. Like definitely there's a huge difference between Global South and Global North, in authorship especially. So yeah, just to sort of understand the status of the research, of the interest in the research.
Okay, thank you for that. All right, well, let's open it up to questions and comments. Anyone has any? Tiana, please go ahead.
Hi, wonderful presentations, everybody. I've learned a lot just from your PowerPoints and your discussions. I have a question about the International Law Project. Dixon, I believe that's you. So I'm a disaster and emergency management student, and so I study a lot about disasters and the differing definitions that exist in different countries, used by different agencies. And I'm wondering, to what degree was your definition of disaster informed by maybe the legal definitions of disaster or the formal definitions in different countries? For instance, I know the Canadian Disaster Database defines disasters very specifically as 10 or more people killed, 100 or more people affected or injured, historical significance, significant damage or disruption. So they have to meet some sort of numerical criteria as well as qualitative. I was just wondering kind of to get your expertise, your thoughts on that. I know it might be difficult to kind of summarize those if you're looking at it through an international lens, but I'm just curious to hear what you came across.
Thank you for the question, Tiana. There are no really uncontroversial definitions of disasters, and in the international law side, they really try to keep it flexible to a certain degree. Now, the reason why I stumbled upon my own definition through the research I've done on sort of definitions of disasters, is sort of just keeping the door open on considering events out of the traditional box of disasters, of natural disasters. So disasters in the traditional sense were always linked to naturally occurring disasters through natural hazards. So in many ways, many disciplines still view disasters as such. Law, in the sense, has started to deviate from that, and the realization of sort of the different causes of disaster is changing that definition. So,
Very interesting. Thank you so much. You know, as a student, an undergraduate student who has definitely considered law school a couple of times, it was really interesting to hear your take on this because, you know, I'm coming from a disaster management background, interested in law. So this was kind of totally new to me. I really enjoyed listening to it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Tiana and Dixon. So Raphael and then Idil.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Neil, Dixon, and Isaac. Let me put my hand down. So this was really interesting. I have questions for all of you, but I think I will limit to Isaac. But just before I go, well, before I go to my question, just wanted to say that I think it's very interesting, the work that all of you are doing. With Neil, I find particularly interesting the idea of looking at, I saw that you have a little box or an indicator for social conflict and climate change, and then how can that inform, you know, different approaches to gender. Conflict affects gender in different ways. So I find it very interesting. I'm not going to ask you this. Maybe if you have time, you can answer. So what's next? How do you plan to, or if you plan to move forward with this? You know, so just a couple of things that I thought. For Dixon, I'm a big fan of history, and I would be very curious to see how this kind of review or how you reframe things can inform, you know, basically how history can inform disaster governance policy. I think that will be a brilliant thing to see. So how you are going to review this concept and the way we approach, especially in light of, you know, the new ways we look at nature and we look at human agency. So that will be very interesting. And for Isaac, super interesting, Isaac. Thank you for your presentation. My question is a bit more sort of abstract. You're into something very interesting there. And I was just wondering if you have already come up with a vision, sort of a short one sentence or one paragraph, a vision of this sort of relation, this new way to relate with microbials, which is not necessarily a bad thing, as I understood from your presentation. So my question to you is whether you were able already to frame into a small, maybe a sort of an end goal or a vision that we should aspire to. Have you come up with that already?
No, I think you're right that that's a crucial part. I think to you know, this thing that I'm proposing is only convincing insofar as people agree with it and believe it and understand it. And so having a single sentence or a single paragraph that kind of captures where I think the argument in that second chapter leads to will be crucially important. I don't have it yet. All that I have for that so far is the first part, essentially amassing together the critiques on the current ways that we talk and think about antimicrobials. My idea builds on some of the recommendations from those previous critiques, suggesting that we take a more ecological or a wider view of the relationship between humans and microbes. I suggest that we think of it in terms of these boundaries, similar to how other planetary problems are conceived. But I don't have, you know, that really nice and crispy one sentence of how we might see it, as opposed to fighting against microbes, or as opposed to trying to master microbes, or whatever the case may be. I don't have the words for how I would envision it. But thank you for that question.
Yet, you don't have it yet.
I don't have it yet. Exactly. Yeah. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you, Raphael and Isaac. So Idil, you're next.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mary. And thank you, everyone, for the excellent presentations. There's not enough time for me to ask a question to everyone. So my question is to Nilanjana. Nell, congratulations for defending your MES project. That's a milestone, and hearing the project being presented by you really testifies to the quality. I was really struck, first of all, the focus on gender for health impact of climate change, especially with the regional focus that you have, is absolutely timely. What really struck me as valuable in your project now is the systematic review that you've done, and I was really impressed with the bibliometric analysis. So my question is methodological. The importance of gender is really fascinating, and you showed a graph where you were explaining the all male authorship, all female authorship. Now, recognizing the complexity of gender, as you also voiced, I'm curious to know how you tracked in your data the gender in the authorships. So names are not always good indicators, and even if they were, they don't always reflect the way people self-identify. So this is not just tinkering, but I'm really curious how you grappled with that, especially with your acknowledgement of the complexity and the difficulty with grappling with data. So over to you, I'd be very interested to hear if you could share a little bit more on that.
Sure. I decided on that bit towards the end. As you're absolutely right. Names, don't do justice to the gender. So I had to go into manually into the articles and identify what universities or what institutions they're from, in certain circumstances, like in certain for certain people, it was very hard. So I had to identify 2 or 3 articles, or even go into their LinkedIn or go into their universities to identify, through photos, basically, mainly through photos. Some names, especially from Global North, was easy to identify, and I think I was lucky because there were only 60 articles that I had to do that for. So just really cases. Some were easy, some were hard. Some I had to go into LinkedIn and or Google Scholar or into the universities and departments to identify who they were. So, but I thought it was important to distinguish and compare between the 2 apps. But yeah, it was quite a bit of work, but I'm glad I did it.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Idil and Nell, for the question and the answer. And sounds like you went to a lot of trouble, Nell, to try and identify those authors. Yeah. So I'm going to leave the last few minutes. I do have a couple of announcements and information for everyone. And if we have time after, maybe we can have one more question. From Shauna, her news item is that the new Dahdaleh Institute Research Community Forum is now up and running, and we have moved the forum to a listserv. So the intention of the forum is to provide a space for dialogue about global health research and for sharing events, resources, and opportunities beyond those that are profiled in our weekly newsletter. I encourage you to subscribe and hope that the forum becomes a dynamic space for exchange and collaboration. Shauna will post a link in the chat where you can sign up. And actually, that's the first announcement. And there's a second one from Idil, which Idil, you can chime in if I've not gotten it right. But basically, Idil is hiring a research assistant for her SPHRI group, preferably at the PhD level. And the competition closes this Sunday. And there's a link. And I'm just wondering if Teresa or Idil, you could just put the link perhaps in the chat. And secondly, the Dahdaleh Institute is accepting applications for the Dahdaleh Global Health Graduate Scholarships. And the competition closes on Friday, January the 14th. So that application timeline is synchronized with when most graduate applications are due here at York, so that hopefully the results of that competition will be known for the admission committees admitting students to the grad program. And I see Naeem has included the link for the, the link for the graduate student applications. And so these would be, I would say, mostly for international students, because our domestic students, you all receive funding from York University. Mostly the fund has supported international students who don't benefit from that. But anyways, and just let's see what our time, well, we have time for maybe one very short question if anyone would like to go ahead. Otherwise, we will just, so next Wednesday, we are having a social gathering and we're going to be offering for members a delivery of pizza, I believe. So that's for next week. Okay. I don't see any hands up, so.
Mary, I just wanted to answer Raphael's question.
Oh, absolutely.
He can help me just do that. So I've just done the qualitative part of the modeling. I've just scratched the surface, really. I have a lot more to learn about systems thinking and gender, which was pretty, obvious in my defense yesterday. I'm still quite naive from the social, sense of gender. So I'm applying for a PhD at York again, and I hope to turn this model into a quantitative model using, the same complex systems diagram that the project at Dahdaleh is using. So yeah, those are the next steps. So provided I get accepted, I will go ahead and do that. Thank you for asking questions.
Great. And which program are you applying to now?
For now, environmental studies, but I think I will also apply to geography. I don't think global health PhD is open until 2023.
No, it's not up and running. We're aiming for fall of 2023. So hopefully by the end of 2022, we can start inviting applications.
Okay. Let's hope I don't have to wait for that long.
Okay.
No.
And sorry, go ahead, Rafa.
Very quickly, I just posted a link to a website that I used when I was working in West Africa. I see that they have the system in Malawi. So maybe you just have a look and see the kind of work they do. So that's an example for you to perhaps build on and compare. Yeah.
Oh, perfect. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Okay, and I think there were a couple of suggestions for also Abe suggested you could apply to help the Health Policy and Equity Program. And also everyone can take a look at Idil's note that she's looking for students who are starting to do a PhD with experience in lit review, data collection, analysis, with qualitative and quantitative research method skills. So good luck with that, identifying someone to support you and your exciting research, Idil. Okay, so thank you so much for all of the presenters and all of you today for some great thought-provoking presentations and questions, and all the best to all of our students in their research. And congrats, Nell, on your completing this phase of your academic trajectory. Look forward to seeing you all next week. All right, thanks so much. Bye for now.
Bye.